The Democrat activist federal judges that have been unconstitutionally obstructing Donald Trump are now publicly attacking the Supreme Court for upholding the Constitution instead of participating in their illegal, Trump-deranged judicial coup. And the stifling of their strategy is causing Democrat politicians to come out and claim that the Supreme Court is authoritarian and corrupt. So despite the Democrats pretending that their sole purpose for existing is to protect the Constitution against Donald Trump, they always reveal their true hatred and disdain for the Constitution anytime they don't get what they want. As always, like the video and subscribe to the channel, guys. We are on the road to 400,000 subscribers, but let's listen to this crazy lunatic Democrat congresswoman call the Supreme Court corrupt because they keep siding with Donald Trump.
Well, my thoughts are that I'm really distressed that the Supreme Court is starting to overturn lower courts. In fact, I was just reading an article where several federal judges are saying, you know, we have also been entrusted with upholding the law. And when the Supreme Court just gives a one-sentence overturn of the lower courts, it is essentially taking a lot of power away from the lower courts to rule and centralizing that power in a Supreme Court that people really don't have faith in. I mean, this Supreme Court has corrupt justices who people understand have been bought and paid for. I think we are on the brink of a constitutional crisis because we have a Supreme Court that continues to overturn lower court rulings, continues to allow the president an excessive overreach of power. That's what we're seeing every day.
Oh man, how dare the Supreme Court use its constitutionally vested powers to overturn these federal judges that were using to weaponize the judicial system illegally. The absolute arrogance of these people is astonishing. They believe everybody else in the world is wrong except for them. Every single time one of these activist judges rules in a way that the Democrats appreciate, it's a win for the rule of law. But every time a higher court overturns that ruling, which is what's been happening essentially every time, now we're inching closer to a constitutional crisis. Every time we question one of the unconstitutional rulings by these activist judges, we're called fascists and have to get lectured about checks and balances. But every time they question a ruling they don't like, it's because the courts are abdicating their responsibilities and allowing for an authoritarian takeover. Duh. But let's hear about these federal judges who are furious that the Supreme Court won't allow their political weaponization of the justice system.
NBC News exclusive on the beef between the Supreme Court and some federal judges. In very rare interviews, 10 of them tell our Lawrence Hurley they're frustrated with the Supreme Court for overturning rulings that went against the White House with little or no explanation. One judge even alleging that the Supreme Court, which of course includes 3 Trump nominees, is throwing them under the bus. Another says the high court is trying to make it look like the lower courts are biased against the president, telling us it is inexcusable. They don't have our backs. In the big picture here, the Supreme Court has granted the Trump administration requests to block lower court rulings in more than 70% of its emergency cases brought by the administration.
I don't know about you, but I'm starting to think that Democrats really don't care about the rule of law. They just use it as a talking point when it suits them. The job of the Supreme Court isn't to have the backs of the federal courts. Their job is to uphold the Constitution, which the federal court judges clearly have no interest in doing. It doesn't matter to Democrats that Donald Trump has been blocked by federal courts more than any other president in history by a long shot. Because to them, Donald Trump is a dictator, so everything he does is illegal, and therefore all of these federal court rulings are justified. They ignorantly believe that because it makes them feel righteous. Every time one of these activist rulings come out, Democrats love to scream from the mountaintops. The court said Donald Trump doing this thing was illegal. They get the headline that validates their delusion. And because hating Donald Trump is their entire personality, when one of these upper courts overturns that ruling, they see it as a personal attack on themselves and therefore declare that the entire system is corrupt. But one of these whiny federal judges gives the most shocking, emotionally manipulative, fear-mongering explanation for why the Supreme Court needs to stop overturning their rulings. Take a look.
Right. These judges are getting a lot of personal threats because of the rulings against the Trump administration. There's very harsh criticism of their rulings coming from the president himself, but also his allies on social media and so on. And so they're operating under a lot of pressure, and I think that has changed the mood a little bit within the judiciary. I think maybe they're a little more open to speaking out. And so that's what happened here. One of the judges even said, somebody's going to get killed, because that's how concerned they are. They're concerned about answering the door when someone knocks on the door, all these kind of things. So, and there's been an evidence of a rise in threats against judges, and they're concerned that the Supreme Court's actions are kind of serving to kind of validate these concerns or the criticisms, because the court is overturning these decisions without any comment.
But so that's an important piece of it here. It's not just that they're it sounds like from the interviews you had, it's not just that they're overturning some of these decisions. It's that they're not really explaining why.
So what they're saying is this: our judicial coup only works if we're allowed to overstep our legal authorities and defy the constitutional separations of power. And if the Supreme Court keeps doing its job, then we're gonna die. Like, it's just childish emotional blackmail. It's the same reason Democrats give for why we have to trans the kids, because if you don't let them, then they're all just going to kill themselves. The Democrat urge to call everything they don't like authoritarian is the reason Americans don't take them seriously anymore. Donald Trump's an authoritarian, but the courts are just because, see, they ruled against him. But when the courts rule in favor of him, now all of a sudden that entire institution is authoritarian too. It's because the Democrats can never be wrong. Remember AOC saying how Biden should defy the Supreme Court when they said he couldn't just cancel everyone's student debt? Remember when Democrats advocated for packing the Supreme Court because they don't want unbiased interpretation of the Constitution? They want partisan interpretation of the Constitution that benefits them. But here's another angry Democrat saying, hell with the Constitution. The Supreme Court needs to be held accountable and should actually be beholden to what the lower courts want.
To what extent do any of the lower court judges have any impact on what the Supreme Court can do? And I ask that because it very much feels like the Supreme Court is not bound by anything, really. I mean, like, you'll hear this, and unprecedented though it may be, and really the Supreme Court, it seems, can just ignore it and there be zero recourse whatsoever. Like, so to what extent do they have to even worry about the rest of the federal judiciary?
Well, so there's a couple of answers to that. I mean, you're right. I mean, technically, Supreme Court doesn't have to answer to anyone, right? It doesn't have to answer to lower court judges for sure.
They're not even hiding the strategy anymore. They want one of any 700 federal judges to, at any time, for any reason, be able to halt the entire functioning of the federal government. They don't care if it's illegal. They don't care if it's unconstitutional. They don't care about the legitimate powers vested to the president by the Constitution. And the Supreme Court keeps ruling against these federal judges. And these federal judges keep defying the Supreme Court, which is causing the Supreme Court to be more restrictive with what the federal judges are allowed to do. The Supreme Court keeps reducing the power of the federal courts because they keep abusing it and completely defying the authority of the Supreme Court. But the federal judges demand that the Supreme Court allow them to continue their judicial tyranny, or their lives are at risk now. But instead of demanding accountability for these federal judges who are overstepping their legal authority time and time again, no, Democrats want the Supreme Court to be held accountable. Here's a guy saying it's actually the job of the federal courts to issue unconstitutional rulings.
The first is they can just start to pull their punches and say, you know what? I can't make heads or tails of what the Supreme Court's saying, so I'm myself going to write opinions that are less categorical, that are more, cryptic. And that's not good for anyone. And it actually doesn't help the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court usually wants the lower courts to percolate up these issues. And that requires the lower courts to sometimes stake out positions that turn out to be wrong, but which in the process of staking out these sharp opinions helps the Supreme Court do its job.
See, the problem with the Democrats is they're willing to accept this unconstitutional, illegal action from federal judges because when they say Donald Trump is doing something illegal, it validates what they want to believe. And anything contrary to that belief must be willfully ignored. When another judge overturns a ruling, Democrats don't say, okay, I thought what he did was illegal, but I guess not. They say, well, this judge said it was illegal, therefore it's illegal. I don't care what anybody else has to say. And that's why it's so hard to find common ground with Democrats, because they're just comfortable in their ignorance. I always have to remind Democrats, the Colorado Supreme Court unconstitutionally ruled Donald Trump could not be on the presidential ballot. And the United States Supreme Court overturned it 9-0 because it was so blatantly unconstitutional and subverted the entire democratic process. And that's all the proof you need that politically motivated judicial weaponization against Donald Trump happens all the time. Donald Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act to speed up deportations, and a federal judge blocked it. And the Supreme Court said, you have no authority to block this. This is a wartime measure authorized by the commander-in-chief. Some federal judge doesn't arbitrarily get to determine what a predatory incursion means. If Mexican troops walked across the border, would the president have to get approval from 700 district court judges before he was able to do something about it? And a Democrat might say, well, that's different. It's much more open to interpretation whether allowing 20 million people into this country illegally or not is an invasion. But how do you know? Like the last guy just said, these lower courts are allowed to be wrong. So who's not to say that one judge looks at 20,000 Mexican troops marching across the border and says, nah, I'm gonna block it? He'd be allowed to, right? We would all have to accept that it was unconstitutional and wait till it got overturned by an upper court. But Democrats love to claim if Donald Trump ever defied a court order, oh my God, that's the end of the republic right there. But they have no problem when federal judges do it. They have no problem when Democrat governors do it or Democrat mayors do it. So despite the Supreme Court ruling that parents have a right to opt their kids out of LGBTQ indoctrination, the state of Washington is openly defying that order and saying, nope, you can't opt out. Take a look at this.
For kindergartners, the objective is kids get to identify their own gender, and then the program lists at least 3 genders. And then the key message of this program is some people are boys, some people are girls, some people are both, and some people are neither. Again, we're talking about kindergartners.
So they're indoctrinating kids starting in kindergarten. And in response to the Supreme Court ruling, this is what the Seattle public school system put out. They said, there is no option to opt students out of learning about particular identities or groups of people. This guidance is reinforced by OSPI, State Superintendent's Office, the policies of other major urban districts, including the states of California and New York, and the outcomes of federal cases around the country. We celebrate all students in SPS. And Democrats are celebrating this because they don't care about the rule of law. They don't care about the Constitution. They only care about ideological supremacy. They'll say the courts are the backstop to authoritarianism when it suits them, and then the courts are actually complicit in handing our country over to a dictator. They'll say Donald Trump is weaponizing the justice system. But here are Democrat judges literally throwing a public tantrum that they're being stopped from weaponizing the justice system. They'll say Donald Trump doesn't care about the Constitution, but Democrats are now advocating that the Supreme Court doesn't have final binding authority, as is written in the Constitution, because they won't assist in their personal fight against Donald Trump. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Turn on those notification bells so you never miss a video. And I will see you guys in the next one.